there's a thing that we do here called the prelude. I have to admit that I didn't know what I was going to talk about today because the theme was interconnectedness. And so if you say to me beauty or joy or wonder, I can talk for hours. But when you say interconnectedness, that's a little too abstract for me. And fortunately, I was rescued when I looked at the musical list, when I saw that the prelude are two songs. One is a song that's called Unity Village, and the other one is a song that's called Bilbao. And so we're going to talk about interconnectedness today, and I'm going to start out by talking about these two songs. What these songs have in common is, well, first of all, they're both Pat Metheny songs. They're both jazz songs, and they're both songs that I like, and they're also songs that aren't written. So a lot of times when you look at jazz, somebody will just excuse me, write a song, improvise on the song, and do that over and over and over and over and over again. So Pat Metheny is a jazz musician that doesn't do that. And so the two songs that Mark and Dale played today, a song for Bilbao, Unity Village, Pat Metheny says, he sings one song, he writes one song, and his entire life has been playing that song over and over and over again, but in many, many, many different ways. And what we call that is improvisation. And improvisation is not randomness. Improvisation is jazz. And jazz is a distinctly American form of music. So when you get to this song, which was written a long time ago, and then you get to this song, which was written, and by written I mean he played it, we're talking about the continuation of a song that's interconnected. So by raise of hands, and I can see you at home too, how many of you know what Unity Village is? Wow, that's pretty good, seeing as this is a Unity church. Unity Village is the headquarters, that's HQ, it's the school where all Unity ministers are trained, are ordained, and indoctrinated in the way of unity. And you could tell that I was not there. But the thing is that this song is important because Pat Metheny, the jazz guitarist and pianist, he grew up here. You see, this is in Kansas City, and Kansas City is the home of jazz in the form that we call bebop. So we know New Orleans jazz, Dixieland jazz, and crosshand jazz, and all kinds of styles of jazz that came up from New Orleans. It came up the river and up the Mississippi and to the Missouri to Kansas City, and it changed. Jazz grew up in Kansas City in the same way that baby back ribs in the South came to Kansas City and became beef ribs. Right? The music became beefy. Big band jazz. Dizzy Gillespie. Now I can't remember any of their names. Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk. All of those guys played Kansas City. And in Kansas City is the home of the Fillmores, where they started a school and they started a village that at one time had hundreds, like 250 people living there. And one of the families that lived there was Pat Metheny's family. And his family was the church band. His grandfather was a famous trumpeter, and they played in the big bands all over Kansas City. And the big bands only played on Saturday night and Friday night when the big dances were in the big ballrooms. And so you had dozens and dozens and dozens of musicians who had nothing to do for the rest of the week. And so how did they make money? Because it didn't pay to be in a band of 50 people in a ballroom. You got paid next to nothing. Just the pleasure of playing in a big band with all of these amazing, amazing band leaders that were there at the time. So they played in the clubs, and they played at restaurants, and they played at churches. So if you were lucky, you got a gig playing bebop in a club, but you didn't have a big band. They can only afford one guy on a piano or one guy and if it was a big club, they'd have two guys. And if it was a really good club, you had what was called a three-dog night. That's where that band comes from, by the way. A three-dog night refers to it's so cold that you have to sleep with three dogs. But in Kansas, a three-dog night means that you have a trio. And Pat Metheny belonged to the church trio. And so while they played in the clubs during the week, they were at church on Sunday playing. And so this is a song that is the remembrance of Pat Metheny of those times when he played with his father and his brother, and I think his grandfather played there too. And so, what does this have to do with this, besides the fact that they're by the same guy? Well, bebop, if you were to Google it right now, don't do that. Take your phones and Google this. You at home, don't do this either. Bilbao is a place in Spain. And my teacher, whose best friend is a man named Akiwowo Akinsole, who is the premier, or was before he died, ethnomusicologist, knew where music came from and how music was interconnected and how it was interrelated, told me that the word bebop is not a meaningless word like you will find in your dictionary or in your Google search. Bebop comes from the word Bilbao. And Bilbao is a place in the Basque region of Spain where music came from. And the word came because in Paris, where they were playing jazz, when the jazz big bands broke down into the clubs, into duos and trios, because they had three-dog nights too, they would play the big band sound, but instead of a band, the piano player or the guitar players would become the whole band. And the style that became popular in Paris was American jazz called bebop. But bebop, the word, comes from Bilbao in Spain. Why? Because gypsy jazz comes from Spain. Why? Because the gypsies lived in the Basque region of Spain and lived on the ocean by the border of the mountains, the Pyrenees Mountains and Iberian Peninsula, and what we think of as mulatto Spain. The word mulatto does not mean half white, half black. It means a Spanish white person or black person who has converted to the Muslim religion, and the border of the Muslim peninsula was blocked by the Basque people. And the Basque people are these people who are not related to anybody else in the world. They're like ginkgo trees. I'm going to be going all over the place, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. These people are not related to any people in the entire world because their gene, their DNA group, is totally extinct everywhere. But now we know where they come from. In the 1400s, though, up through France came these other people. These other people were called Sinti and Roma people. That's what we call gypsies. We call them gypsies because the Catholic Church accused them of the Egyptian heresies, which meant that they worshipped Isis and Astarte and Ashra. That means the women. And the women were all witches, and those witches were called gypsies. And the gypsies came up into the Iberian Peninsula, and they joined the Basques. Why? Because they were both hated, because they were both people of color, because Basques were considered black people, and gypsies were considered black people. And that's not an epithet or necessarily wrong, because we know today that they come from India. The Sinti people come from Pakistan. They come from Sinti in Pakistan. Why were they up there? Well, because they had to leave India. Why did they have to leave India? Because they were lepers. They were the unwanted people. Now, by the time they came through Morocco and up into Spain and through Egypt and up into Europe and around the Mediterranean, they no longer had leprosy. But those leper colonies from two different places in India and Pakistan, two literal villages, gave us what we call the gypsy people. Sinti, Roma, Gitaan, Dark Dutch. So my grandfather was Dark Dutch. And so his people came from Germany. His name was von Itersen, and they were pushed out of Germany. And they then moved into the Netherlands. Why? Because William of Orange needed people to train the horses. And who knew how to train the horses? Well, when you look at Lipizzaner stallions, and when you look at the Gitaan horses of France, and when you look at the Andalusian, those were all trained by gypsy people. Why? Because gypsy people learned from the Arabs, and the Arabs gave them the skills to not only ride horses, but to train horses, to teach horses how to dance, but mostly how to be part of warfare. And so when you hear that there are people who are horsemen, those horsemen were usually landed gentry who were on horses because that way they wouldn't get killed, and all the foot soldiers got killed. But words like cavalier and chevalier and those kinds of words were words that described knights. And knights had people who took care of their horses and trained their horses, and by and large, most of them were gypsies. Well, when the Crusades were over, they weren't needed anymore, and many of them ended up being all over the world and being killed, mainly because they had different religious beliefs. A lot of them ended up in Bilbao. And so one of the words for the gypsy people is Manouchian. And the Manouche people come from the south of France, which is on the other side of the Pyrenees from Bilbao. And so the word bebop comes from one particular guy who loved Kansas City bebop. and wanted to play it. And so he played in the big bands in Paris. But this guy's name was Django Reinhardt, and he had a horribly deformed left hand. That's the hand that you play on the neck of the guitar. And so he had specially designed guitars that he played. And he used to play the left hand of the piano sound here. And instead of playing like Spanish players and jazz players do, he couldn't do that. He played by retuning his guitar, and his hand, which was melted and scarred together, became like a slide. And he created this sound that when you listen to bebop and jazz, and when you listen to this sound, you hear the left hand of the piano because of his deformity. Django Reinhardt was a gypsy. He was a Manusha, and he was related to the people of bebop. And the kind of guitar that he played, so if you saw a picture of Pat Metheny here, you see a dobro guitar with the metal face, and you also see hollow body jazz guitars. These are Spanish guitars. Very often they have 12 strings. And the sound of bebop was the sound of the left hand of the piano playing chords, very cool, very relaxed, and the right hand playing the guitar like it was a mandolin. Not just a mandolin, but like it was a sitar. Why? Because it came from India. The sound of jazz and the sound of guitars started in India. They came up through the Iberian Peninsula and Morocco, across the desert, and they came up through Egypt, just like the gypsies. Why? Because that's who brought them. And so when all of these things came together and connected, you got the sound of flamenco guitar. And the sound of flamenco guitar influenced the Western players in the United States. And so when jazz met Western instruments like banjos, like guitars, like mandolins, sometimes you got bluegrass and sometimes you got bebop. And bebop was specifically the sound of music that came from Kansas City. Kansas City. Interconnectedness. Not just the interconnection of this in some guy's mind who's standing in front of you talking, or some musician who's playing the guitar, but in everything. It's coming up here today, getting my coffee and donut because I'm used to getting it here. That's really the only reason I come here is because they have coffee and donuts. And and so I'm just happy to see you are all still here with us, even though we don't have coffee and donuts. And so I like to imagine that you're here to see me. So I get dressed up to come here, and not always the way people want. And so I'm at the Speedway, and the guy says to me in the donut, in front of the donut place, we're both getting donuts, and I'm waiting for him. He turns around and he looks at me, and he says, this guy is like 6 foot something or other, and he's wearing a cowboy hat, and he's got this big belly, and he's got the boots and everything. And he looks at me and he goes, you know, you're not supposed to wear white after Labor Day. So evidently in Cascade or Ada, in this area, he's the arbiter of fashion. And so I immediately got the feeling that my father was there. Not that my father wore cowboy boots or was 6'3". He was actually 5'3". But the fact that he had rules. I have rules. But my rules are based upon the rules of improvisation. Not just in musical improvisation, But I come from a theater background, and theater improv is not just randomly doing stuff without a script or telling a sermon without a script. Improv has rules, but those rules have to do with interconnectivity. So when a jazz musician plays, they're not just randomly making up stuff. They are interconnected to each other. Mark plays with Dale. They can get together and never talk and make it sound really good because it's really good. When Pat Metheny played with his group, which was called, I keep pointing up at this spider as if it's Pat Metheny. When Pat Metheny used to play with his group, the Metheny group, or the Pat Metheny trio, or the group that he called Unity, they very often would practice, and then they would sit down, and everything that they practiced would have nothing to do with what they did on stage. If you were ever to see Pat Metheny play Unity Village by himself or with one other guy, be it a drummer or a piano player or another guitar player, or once I saw him with a banjo player, he plays the beginning of Unity Village like a flamenco guitar concert of a Spanish flamenco guitarist. Why? Because Bilbao is the home of bebop. But it's not just the home of bebop. It's the place where Vasco da Gama left to discover the New World, and his New World was to sail around the Horn. And where did he land? India. Vasco da Gama, see, in Spanish, we don't say the B as a B, we say it as a V. So Bilbao and Vasco da Gama he was a Basque. He was not just a Basque, but really, he was a gypsy. He came all the way around the Horn to discover India, brought all kinds of riches back from India. And because in 1460 he did that, the Dutch realized there was lots of money to be made. The British realized there was lots of money to be made. They went down there and they cut off Spain and Portugal, and they created a monopoly, and they ruled India, and they ruled Indonesia, the Southeast Indies. So the Dutch East Indies Company and the India Company of Britain had a monopoly, so that by the 1490s, some guy comes to the Queen of Spain and says, I know a shortcut. That was Christopher Columbus. He comes all the way around, and he runs into North America. And he runs into North America, and he starts raping and pillaging, literally, an entire 2 continents. And he starts to make slaves out of them, and he kills them with smallpox. And so he needs to have slaves, and so he brings them from Africa, and from Africa he brings these slaves, and these slaves create the music that becomes jazz, and that jazz comes up to New Orleans and then to Kansas City, where the influence of Spanish and gypsy music that comes up from Spain and Mexico and the mestizo people, because they're growing this beef. And the cattle are in Kansas City to become slaughtered. That these cultures meet. And they meet with instruments that started in the Arab countries, the guitar and the banjo, the banjar, and started in India. Everything is interconnected. My father loved music. He and his brothers played in their church. They're Mandarin Chinese. Their family's been in Indonesia for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the first time I ever heard them play, it was guitars, a big guitar, a big Spanish guitar with a bass. And my grandpa played the mandolin, and he played the banjo. And they sang 4-part bluegrass harmony. Chinese guys, old Chinese guys playing and singing church music. And church music to them, because of the Azusa revival and the Pentecostal revival, was bluegrass music. It was gospel, 4-part harmony. And that's what they sang. And so to my dad, that was church music. And to rebel, he listened to jazz music. And with the kind of jazz music he listened to Django Reinhardt. Why? Because his fingers weren't fast enough to play, and he could play bar chords. He loved Django Reinhardt. Now, his mom ran away from home because it was an arranged marriage when he was very little. And so my dad was raised by slaves, and so the slaves actually taught him how to play guitar. My grandmother, his mother, ran away to the other side of Indonesia and entered into an orphanage and became a volunteer at an orphanage where she met her husband, who actually taught her how to cook, but that's a different story. And my mother had been left at this orphanage because she was a blonde woman, a blonde little girl, in a place where if you were a mixed blood, you would be killed. Her family looked like me, but because her father was Dutch, she had blonde hair. And so she was left at this orphanage, and my other grandmother adopted her. And so when the war was over and they lived in the ghetto, my father and mother met because my grandmother was in the ghettos of the Netherlands, and they met because my mother's brother was playing gypsy jazz bass at the air bases in the Netherlands. And my dad loved that music, and my mom's family were all musical people, and they, to this day, my cousins all are gypsy jazz singers. So a lot of the gypsy jazz singers you see in Germany and the Netherlands are Indos. Indos are Indonesians that come from India, all right? Everything's interconnected. When I was growing up, and I am winding up here, when I was growing up, I could care less about that kind of music. I was into guitar rock. So to me, my heroes were Peter Frampton and Eddie Van Halen. Because, I was a man of musical taste at that time. And I loved the Beatles and all kinds of other things, but I didn't discover anything in the early 70s. But when my brother veered off into disco, which is even funnier than Chinese people playing bluegrass, especially if you ever saw him dance, if you could have seen me in the 70s, I had long hair down to my back. I actually had hair there. And so I looked like, earlier I looked like Angela. I forget her, Angela Davis. But when that fell, I looked like Eddie Van Halen or Peter Frampton. And so I had permed hair without having to perm it. Why? Because I was an Indo. Eddie Van Halen did not have to perm his hair. Why? Eddie Van Halen was born in the Netherlands because he was an Indo, which meant that his father was Dutch and his mother was Indonesian. And so my wish to become the greatest Dutch-Indonesian guitar player was dashed because Eddie Van Halen and his brother all were musical virtuosos and played amazingly. Why? Because Eddie Van Halen's father was a jazz musician in the Netherlands at the same time my family was. And so my family's name was Van Helden, and their name was Van Halen, and his family was playing gypsy jazz music. His father was a trumpeter. And so he entered the United States at the age of 12 and started to play guitar like a virtuoso when he was a child. And he played the piano like a virtuoso. I did not. Peter Frampton, Eddie Van Halen, two guitar heroes of mine. At a certain point in the late 70s or the early 80s, Peter Frampton, whose left hand was horribly deformed in a car accident that made it almost impossible for him to play, one of the greatest rock guitarists in the world, started bidding on a set of guitars. And Eddie Van Halen started to bid against him for these guitars. And into this guy named Pat Metheny, who I'd never heard of before, also started bidding on these guitars. Why? Because they were the guitars of Django Reinhardt. Peter Frampton won that because Peter Frampton had the #1 best-selling album of all time, which nobody probably remembers. But he had so much money that he won against Paul McCartney, he won against Eddie Van Halen, he won against Pat Metheny. I became curious who this Pat Metheny guy was, to think that he could really want the guitars that Eddie Van Halen wanted. And I started to listen, and the first song I heard, Song for Bebo, Unity Village. I grew up with a father who was, he was paranoid and schizophrenic, but a comorbid symptom of that, a lucky symptom of that, was he had OCD. And part of his OCD was to listen to one piece of music over and over and over and over again. And so we didn't have headphones in those days. We had these giant furniture pieces called consoles that had everything in them. And then we had albums. Okay, some of you remember albums. And so he had all of these albums. And sometimes he would listen to Glenn Miller for 6 months. And then he started to listen to Django Reinhardt. And so I heard Django Reinhardt growing up incessantly, and it was part of the music that I grew up loving. And when I listened to Pat Metheny for the first time, I knew that that was the music that I wanted to play. I never got to actually play that music. I became a drummer, because, Dale knows this. When you can't really play an instrument, you actually become a drummer, No, just kidding. The thing is that everything is interconnected. Everything. Everything I just said today, I didn't write. But it's all in me. They're all pieces of my story. Pat Metheny says that when he started playing Unity Village, he didn't record it for many years afterwards. It's based upon his being in the church band. It's also based upon listening to bebop music and loving Django Reinhardt. Mark and Dale, you want to play a little for me? Let's close our eyes and meditate on interconnectivity. That's a hard word to wrap around. Because if everything is interconnected, what does it mean? Interconnectivity is not unity. Just because we're connected does not mean we are one. We are actually one. but the need for us to be ourselves, to take care of ourselves, or to take care of our own, creates separation in us. The world now, more than ever, not just this country, not just politics, but everything, me included, because there is nobody more petty or snarky on Facebook than me. If you're one of my friends, you know this. And if I deal with my politics as if it were a sport, I can trash talk, I can criticize, I can fight. But when it's all done, the opponents have to come together because they're interconnected. The needs of one side and the needs of another side are really the same. The things that separate us are literally, like we see in our politics, less than 1%. And unity is not agreeing. Unity is agreeing to be one for the greater good of all. And all means those who have not been part of the greater good or have gotten the benefit of the greater good. But all also means all of us in the future, the next 7 generations. You can give me any 3 words, and I can improvise and put them together. That's just simply how I tell stories. But the thing is that the fact that I can connect things together is because I follow the same rules that Mark and Dale follow. Is that when somebody does something or says something or gives me a melody, I can take that thing, no matter how good or how bad or how much I agree with it or disagree with it, and say, yes, and. I empathize with whatever you give me. I don't agree with it, but I integrate it and accept it as your truth, and I add my truth. And that's what evolves things, and that's how revolution happens as well. My prayer for all of us, for all of you, is that as tough as it was to watch the last week, that we were also watching a miracle. And I hope you realize that the literal ability for one country to have 150 million people voting with passion for the things that they believe and come out on the other side of it is a miracle. And it's the beginning of a greater miracle, I hope. But the path to the miracle is to understand that we're not different, that we're not separate, that we are interconnected, and that interconnectivity gives us the empathy with all of us, with each other, to actually create unity. Because unity is not a noun. It is not an adjective. Unity is a verb. What are we going to do from here on out to create unity? We can't stay in our villages. We can't stay where we came from. We have to do and start from where we are and from this point on. Namaste. Thank you so much for your attention.